Hi there, I'm Steve Sweeney, Vice President of Business Development and Strategy at Viz AI, and I'm excited to welcome you to the Vizion Expert Series, a podcast that focuses on visions and visionaries shaping the future of healthcare. And given the increasing role AI is playing, we dive deep into AI and agents that are driving real-world impact in healthcare. We talk to innovators and implementers who are helping transform care delivery for both patients and providers. Let's get into it. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Gaurav Singal to the podcast. Gaurav is a physician, entrepreneur, and leader in health tech who has spent his entire career at the intersection of medicine, data science, and innovation. He currently serves as a physician and faculty member at Harvard Medical School and is advisor to many cutting-edge companies in healthcare and AI, including Viz AI. Prior to this work, Gaurav has served as the Chief Data Officer at Foundation Medicine, where he led data strategy and real-world data efforts across that organization. Gaurav brings deep insight into opportunities and challenges transforming patient care with technology. And we're excited to dive into more of that today with him. So with that, Gaurav, maybe before we dive into some of the questions around AI and healthcare, maybe tell us, what's hot for you right now? What do you see going on in the industry in terms of both how AI is shaping healthcare, but broadly how digital is impacting how healthcare is delivered?
Wonderful, Steve. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and an honor. And, I think the world of Viz and the work that you're doing. So it means a lot to be here and also to speak on this topic, which is very near and dear to my heart. Thank you also for the warm introduction. Maybe I'll give you just a little bit of context to set the stage for your question, which is that I entered medicine sort of by accident. I was a computer scientist and electrical engineer, and I studied AI in the context of robotics. And the reason I came to medical school in the first place, now a couple decades ago, was the sense that medicine fundamentally was, at least in part, a computational discipline, and that there was a lot of opportunity to improve the practice and impact of healthcare through AI and computation. And so I started that journey 20 odd years ago, and over that career have tried in almost every step to implement AI in healthcare, including my work at Foundation Medicine. And each time we got sort of closer and closer to it, but there were always things sort of holding back what I felt, and I think many others felt, was the full opportunity to improve clinical care and provider decision making and a whole number of other things, which were part technological, part cultural, part business, part implementation. Sort of pick your angle. All of them were challenging. And to answer your question about what's hot right now, it feels like AI is hot right now. And of course, that's true in the macro and true sort of across industries. Every one of us has used ChatGPT and its sort of myriad alternatives. But in healthcare specifically, it feels like we are in, if not entering, the golden age of AI in healthcare. And my work with Viz AI over the last several years was driven by that interest. When I left Foundation Medicine in 2020, is it felt like, when I looked around in 2020 at how the world had evolved in the decade that I'd spent doing cancer genomics and computation there, was a recognition that AI was already starting to enter the clinical arena as Viz and others were leading. And now, 5 years later, that seems obvious to everybody and in so many different forms. So in a nutshell, not to lead the witness here, it feels like what's hot right now is AI in healthcare. And I know that's what we're going to talk about today. So thanks again for having me.
No, yeah, well, thank you for being here. And yes, AI is very hot. And, we hear, obviously, we live it every day, but I think when we talk to clinicians, the rate of adoption, I think there was an AMA study that came out just this past February that showed AI use in healthcare by healthcare professionals has doubled just in the last year. And so I think it's not only hot for those kind of pushing the boundaries, but for clinicians broadly. So I'm curious, and this obviously doesn't have to be specific to Viz, but curious as to where you've seen in terms of applications, the greatest adoption of AI in the last year or 2 years within clinical practice, that is.
Yeah, it's funny. I've had two conversations just today about AI for physicians, both from physician leaders. One is a practicing physician who's actually quite skeptical of new AI technologies. And his view, and I'll compliment in a second, was there has never been in his career a technological revolution in healthcare that has really benefited physicians. And he pointed to the EMRs as something that was sort of forced upon the clinical community, largely for administrative benefit. And the result of that has been, I think, a net improvement in the technical infrastructure of our healthcare system, the ability to do research and clinical care and a whole bunch of other things downstream of that. But it's come at a real provider cost, right? And I think we experience that as providers or as patients. The other person I spoke to is a senior leader in healthcare who's led multinational organizations, and he was very bullish on AI in healthcare now, not being deeply AI versed by background. And his point was that this is the first time in his career that there has been a pull from providers rather than a push by technologists. And fundamentally, I think that's the biggest difference of our experience now as technologists or as innovators or as entrepreneurs or as providers, that the technologies that are emerging now seem to be genuinely benefiting the provider and the provider patient relationship. And there's many, many examples of that, but it's an interesting sort of shift in the dynamic as new channels have opened, new systems that are provider friendly, that have optimized user experience, that solve a pain point for the providers, not just for the folks doing the billing, and are improving patient care along the way. So I think at a macro, that's a fundamental shift, and one that is driving grassroots adoption, which your question was about adoption. I think grassroots adoption where incentives align, whether financial incentives or utility incentives, like the amount of time that a doctor has to spend writing notes at the end of the day, right, when they're home with their kids, or the amount of time or quality that you can get in terms of looking up information through systems like open evidence, or the work that Viz has done, for example, in helping identify patients who might benefit from treatments that align incentives, both clinical and financial, for providers and health systems. I think some of those changes are really driving adoption of a technology in a way that technology has historically not been rapidly adopted in healthcare.
So it sounds like it's the focus on the user, meaning how do you actually improve the experience or the efficiency of the end user, in this case, the healthcare professional, that's driven, AI adoption in the last few years, where maybe 5 years ago you didn't see it.
Yeah, I would say two things. I mean, if we go back, a decade, right? What drove the adoption of EMRs? It was basically government mandate, more or less, right? Driven through financial incentives. If you look then 5 years ago, maybe, and folks like Viz and others, I think really broke the mold by aligning financial incentives with clinical outcomes across multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem. And that dynamic, it wasn't just the provider. I think the provider clearly benefited, but most of the time, solving for the provider or the patient alone is insufficient to drive the machine of healthcare to change. In my view, the work that Viz did was align incentives for patients and providers, and then also the broader ecosystem. I think in the last, call it 18 to 24 months, we've seen a third bite at this apple that looks even different, which is a lot of organizations solving a pain point just for physicians and adopting a sort of unique go-to-market motion, which is sort of grassroots. It's grassroots not at the institution or health system level, it's grassroots at the provider level,
Yeah.
to the point where providers are adopting technology that is so compelling for their day-to-day that they're just sort of using it sometimes on the down low, right, without the administrators knowing. And to a point where it reaches, I was talking to a hospital CIO about this recently, who was flustered that his docs were signing these with a health technology company in order to be able to use PHI in the engagement, and forced him to the table to have a conversation with that health tech company around an agreement at the health system level. So I would say that if you look at the sort of arc of this, EMR go to market sort of by mandate, right? Ultimate sort of adoption by everybody. I think a next generation in the last 5 years where people were starting to get really smart, innovative about aligning incentives for the whole ecosystem, driving more voluntary adoption, right, by all of the actors. And I think that's a really elegant way to solve that problem. And then more recently, you see a complementary go-to-market motion, which is direct to provider, and in some cases direct to patient, and then driving sort of a bottoms up. And so I see those latter two movements both sort of continue. I wouldn't say the second one has evolved into the third one, but the third one, I'd say, is a net new one. And I think those two things, just being better aligned with the incentives of the users and the decision makers, is now driving adoption in a way that we never saw. At least I never saw early in my career.
Yeah, it's definitely changing, and maybe empowering the clinicians a little bit more to say, I need the help and I'm going to go find a way to find a solution out there that can deliver that. I'm curious, going back to the first person you mentioned that you spoke with today, and maybe their skepticism around whether it be AI or digital, where are they on the adoption curve? Are they adopting AI?
No, this person is not. And
Okay.
honestly, it's because they feel so burned by the healthcare system that they're skeptical that if an administrator, this was in the context of ambient documentation, that
Yeah.
the administrators and others were telling them, oh, this, even peers were telling them this technology is great. There's such a deep-rooted skepticism that technology that enters my world is almost always in service of someone else and not me, right? There's that level of jadedness, and and so that I think is part of the activation energy, right, for a new technology in the healthcare system, right? Why is the bar so high, right, for a new technology to be adopted? I think it's because there's a fair amount of cultural skepticism, and maybe that was driven by a lot of the EMR work, right? I think a lot of providers feel the EMRs were not designed to serve them, right? And yet they're on the user end of that, and they're the ones who have the documentation burden and don't get the time with their patients in the way they used to. At least that's the feeling of a lot of providers, and yet they don't see themselves as the beneficiaries. I think one of the nice things about the more modern or contemporary AI implementations is the providers are not left out as beneficiaries. And so I think slowly we'll see a culture change there. And I think this person is probably on one end of the spectrum in terms of their skepticism. I'd say that that's not the norm, at least that I've experienced in the last few years.
And what for maybe that persona or that cohort of clinicians, what do you think it's going to take to actually get them to adopt? And maybe you can touch on some of the regulation that's either there or not there. How do you build trust with that user so they say, yeah, this is something I want to use, and that's something that I feel comfortable using?
I think at the end of the day, the work that's happening right now is already doing the right thing, which is creating real value, right? Not just for the financiers of the healthcare system in whatever angle, but the actual consumers of that healthcare and that technology, right? Whether it's the providers or the patients. I think to me that would be my North Star, right? Keep creating value for that audience. There will be skeptics and laggards, right? For whom there's a cynicism, there's a pessimism, there's an assumption that that value must either not be real or it's sort of masking the real thing, right? That there's an ulterior motive behind it. And I think over time, as they see more and more their peer cohort adopt these technologies, and frankly, if they use them, right? I feel that if you use an ambient technology, for example, in a way that sort of is matched to your practice pattern, right? It is a little bit specialty dependent right now, and primary care versus outpatient versus inpatient versus, versus sort of subspecialties. So if you're in the sweet spot for that technology, I think it's very hard to use it and not walk away feeling like this is the future and it's going to make my life better, right? I think similarly, if you are the beneficiary of an AI-based screening technology, right, bringing it closer to, let's say, Viz, and a patient of yours ends up on the right treatment or getting diagnosed with a condition that might have otherwise been missed, I don't know how many times you have to do that. Once, twice, three times. Once you've really changed the arc of a patient's life, for most providers, that would be a conversion moment. And so I think, in my mind, they will come eventually because the value that's being created is so significant.
100%. I'm curious. So you mentioned obviously ambient listening. You mentioned the work that we're doing is to increase patient detection and guideline-based follow-up. Where do you see the biggest opportunity yet to be unlocked with AI in clinical practice?
I believe very firmly that decision support for providers, the co-pilot, analog of sort of the programming revolution. I hate to say it, but like Clippy from the ancient days of Microsoft Word,
Yeah.
that idea that a provider could have, you know, humans are fallible, right? Docs train intensely in medical school, in residency, in fellowship. Some stay in academics, go to the conferences every year, read all the papers. Most providers in the US are out serving their communities, right? Wherever, all over the country, they're seeing 40, 50, 60 patients a day. They may or may not have time to go to the conferences, right? Sometimes they're not subspecialized in one, subtype of melanoma, right? They're seeing all cancer patients. And so for that provider, right, which is really I think the vast majority of providers in the country, it is really, really difficult to stay up to date on everything. And you see that manifest by the care gaps, right? If you look at guideline recommended treatments, right? Not necessarily even what's on the label by FDA or how a pharma company will market a product, right? But medicines that are deemed beneficial enough to patient populations that society guidelines, which tend to err relatively conservative, have suggested that this is the right thing to do, sort of en masse for this patient population. When you look at how many patients who meet those criteria are getting those drugs, it can be anywhere from 60% down to 20%.
Yeah.
And if you just think about that as a reflection of the knowledge gap that exists across the modern practice of medicine, to close that gap, I believe would create tremendous value for patients and for other actors in the healthcare system.
Yeah, we couldn't agree anymore. I think that is fundamentally the problem that we were trying to solve is, which is how do you, it's really an information problem, right? How do you understand the patient and their clinical profile better as a clinician, knowing that obviously they've had years of workups and tests done, but you might not be involved in all of those. And so how do you understand the patient better, but then also how do you understand the guidelines? And then how do you marry those up? And you think about particularly when you think about these drugs, precision medicine and the way that that is unfolding, it is increasingly challenging for clinicians to actually know here's the best next step for this patient, given all that exists on that patient, given all that exists in terms of guidelines. And so, having that Clippy at your fingertips to be able to marry those two sources of information up to say, hey, for this kind of patient at this stage, here is what the guidelines might say. So I couldn't agree with you anymore. And I think that's a huge opportunity for not only providing better patient care, but ultimately reducing the burden that exists on clinicians to have to store all that information in their brains.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're exactly right, Steve. I mean, like I said, this is a big part of the reason that I ended up in medicine. And, there's a history of these things, right? There's a history of clinical decision support, if we want to call it that as a category, which is impressive in spots, right? Pretty limited in its implementation. So you think about like med-med interaction, sort of select alerts for providers. My view on that is that it's limited for a couple of reasons. Number one, the accuracy of these systems was limited by the source data and the complexity of the algorithms that could be deployed. And for
Yeah.
the most part, they were highly structured and highly algorithmic, right? By sort of the technology that was available, which meant as inputs, you could basically use structured data points, lab values, ICD-9, 10 codes, billing data, et cetera, whatever was structured and computable in the medical record or associated systems. And then the rules that you had to follow were rigid and pre-programmed and whatever. And so even in the best implementation of those, the ability to actually make sense of the data and produce the right recommendation or alert or clinical decision support was fundamentally limited. And providers being very busy, I'm sure you've heard the term alert fatigue, right? Most of these systems suffered from, I think, inadequate accuracy, and
Yeah.
therefore provider sort of bias towards just brushing it aside because you get it wrong 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 times, or how many times can you get something wrong before a provider says it's not worth my time to consider it? It's probably a false alert, right? And then the second thing has been implementation, which is that very few opportunities existed to actually implement these alerts in the flow such that they reduced provider, workload, which was already sort of reaching limit. Not just a lot of these systems struggled from implementation, right? On the implementation side, you either had a situation where you couldn't put in the right place in the provider workflow, or if you could do that, the provider still had to now do net new actions, right? So it added workload to their plate. I think that the era that's in front of us is one in which you can really get workflow integrated, and that's by virtue of, I think, EMRs opening up a little bit and parallel systems being developed, parallel rails and channels. And then secondly, the ability to actually act upon those results, whether it's to modify the note or the order or the consult or the referral, such that the provider just has to confirm that the action makes sense, but not necessarily take on more work. The goal should be to reduce work. Getting to your earliest point about adoption, right? Those are the things that will help drive adoption and not sort of rate limit adoption.
So it sounds like what's changed. It's both a increased precision and accuracy of the algorithms, if you will, based on better access to data, maybe better underlying models, largely driven by the advent of these large language models and their improvements. And then second, it sounds like tools that actually embed those insights into the workflow. So it reduces the overall burden on the provider. Is that a fair
That's
summary?
right. And I would just say on the last one, ideally one that can even take the action that follows, or at
Yeah.
least facilitate the action. And again, providers are extremely busy and overloaded. So I think just being accurate and decreasing the workload to do the right thing, I think those things go a long way, in addition to all the other incentives that ideally one could align.
Okay. Well, I think I couldn't agree with you anymore. And I think We're starting to see that, but ultimately, like you described, it really comes down to behavior change, right? You have to get clinicians excited, and then you have to embed this into their workflow in whatever manner that takes. I'm curious, you do a lot of work supporting different life science companies. I know pharma coming from Foundation Medicine, obviously, as well. What is your perspective on where pharma, when we think about these clinical agents and AI in clinical practice, the role pharma or med device, broadly life science, plays in that world? How can they play in the world? How are you seeing them play in that world? Where should they play in that world?
I think there's not a pharma company in the world right now that doesn't have board meetings on AI as a main topic. So I think it's entered the zeitgeist without a doubt. I My sense is that people are cautiously optimistic. There's a lot of experiments being run to really test what's real and what's not. And I actually think that's a more general statement about large language models, right? It's a technology that all of us can touch and feel, right, by using it. But because it's not a rigid system, right, that was defined that given input A, you're going to get output B, and it's hard to validate its performance except in sort of contrived examples like medical licensing exams and things like that. I think we're all as a community, forget pharma for a second, we'll come back to pharma, but all of us are trying to figure out what can it do, what can it not do, right? And where does it perform as well as I need to, and where does it fall short? A lot of that conversation was around hallucinations in the early days. Those still exist, but the referenceability now of source data has improved, quality of the models have improved, the sort of reasoning abilities have improved. And so the frontier continues to evolve. But as I use it in my personal life, in my professional life, with partners and clients, I feel like that's a continuous evaluation. So that's a general truism I think about large language models and generative AI. And I think it's true, especially in pharma, where the bar for being wrong, right, is important, right? You cannot afford to be wrong on a regulatory filing or an application or analysis of scientific data and so on. So on the discovery side, obviously there's a lot of interest on target discovery and a lot of the folding models and everything else. In the R&D setting, I've seen it used a lot in clinical trial design and planning, and then in a lot of paperwork preparation. So, consents, protocols, filings, compiling data, pulling together internal data sets and document stores and other things. And then in the commercial setting, which you know about as much as I do, Steve, I think this is a place where I had not spent a lot of time historically, but the commercial side of pharma is really where this all meets clinical practice. And so as you see, I think the adoption of AI on the clinical front, right, which we've been talking about for most of our conversation here, that then creates the rails for it to have an impact on pharma commercial, right? And if we go back to the initial thesis around clinical decision support and the idea that there's such a gap between adoption of clinical guidelines and the adoption of clinical guidelines versus what the guidelines would recommend, the number of patients who are getting the drugs that would otherwise be considered appropriate, the gap there is for patients and for pharma, right? Those are the two people who are suffering the most from that lack of broad adoption. And so fundamentally, I think pharma should be excited about closing that gap.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we see increased interest, at least from my perspective, from pharma on not only playing a role in closing that gap, but partnering with health systems or being a partner to health systems as they try to do that. And so it's definitely an area to watch. Gaurav, I'm going to zoom out briefly. I know we don't have a ton of time left, but I'm curious to get your thoughts looking 5 years into the future, so 2030. What do you think healthcare looks like, and what do you think it looks like with sort of AI by the bedside?
And I think at minimum, a lot of back office in healthcare is massively AI enabled. And the reason is it is arguably lower stakes than the patient provider sort of interaction. It is a place where there's almost certainly a lot of automation and acceleration and a lot of direct financial benefit of doing that. So I think that's a no-brainer. 5-year horizon is actually not very long in the healthcare sort of span, but I think that one is near certain. Number two, there are a few places where I think the provider adoption curve has been so steep that we won't necessarily be limited by the enterprise sales cycles in healthcare and the sort of CIO-led digital transformations of healthcare that can be much longer cycles. The two places I've seen that grassroots the most are in ambient documentation, so systems like Abridge or Nabla or Ambience or Microsoft DAX and many others. And then on the knowledge side, right? And the clear winner there is open evidence, at least so far, where providers are turning to new systems again of their own volition, right? And they're sort of voting with their feet. And ultimately, the stampede will be unignorable, right, by leadership and administration. And it will be a digital transformation, if you will, that is very different from any that I've seen in my career, which is really grassroots driven until it reaches this critical tipping point, right? And I think as a result of that model, it will be much faster than most of these that we've seen previously. The third one that is an unknown to me is what happens on the patient side, right? And I read something or heard something, which hopefully is correctly attributed, that some 20, 30%, some absurd percentage of ChatGPT queries are healthcare related, right?
Wow.
Again, this is people, and maybe it's 10%. Any of those numbers would be insane to me, given the number of things that you might ask the system. There's a reason healthcare is such a huge part of the spending of this country, right? It is a massive thing that is on everybody's mind and part of everybody's life. And so it's only natural that one would turn to these systems. So I think another place I'm very curious, I think in 5 years, how the lay public and how patients approach their own care, I think looks dramatically different because it's accessible, right? The systems exist, they're getting better and better every day. There's companies like Counsel and others that are building systems for patients. And so it's not even a general purpose system, it's going to be a tailored system. So I think you're going to see, to summarize, on the back office is inevitable. In the provider workflows where you get grassroots adoption, I think that's quite inevitable. And then on the patient side, that'll all change within 5 years. And then I think there will be in the background continued evolution of AI diagnostics as a category, which I'm very excited about. Of course, you are as well, that I think will continue to progress through sort of maybe more traditional healthcare timelines and cycles, but I think are so impactful that they will continue to see, I think, real impact and adoption.
Yeah, well, I agree with all what you said, and I think we sit at the edge of something very exciting for patients ultimately, because I think obviously with the amount we spend on healthcare, we certainly can expect better outcomes, and I think AI is going to help drive a lot of that, and so very exciting to kind of see where the next 5 years takes us. Gaurav, I think that's all we have for time. So thank you so much for joining and sharing your insights. It's been a tremendous pleasure. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to catch our next episode as we continue exploring the future of healthcare and AI. Until next time, thank you all.
Thanks so much, Steve.